Hi, it's a pleasure to be here and to be taking forward this discursive afterlife, if you will, of Marianne's exhibition. But I have to say that I'm incredibly nervous, not only because the form of my paper is a little uncertain, because on the one hand I have this completely written and composed essay which is in the book, and now I'm annotating it and opening it out. But also because, like many of you, I'm reeling from Ingrid's revelations about the world financial system, and my immediate reflex is to want to check up on what's happening with my own investments and things, and how much of that circuitry is responsible for what I can't even see. But levity aside, I think what I would maybe like to try and do today is to express through some of these thoughts and arguments also my admiration of Marianne's work, because it reminds us of what the work of the artist is today in dealing with precisely such a complex world of spectralities and invisible forces which shape not only our world but also our experience, and in some fundamental way our subjectivity, our selfhood. And I really do, in fact, feel honored to have been part of this adventure and experiment, because I've been preoccupied for the last couple of years with a set of questions precisely having to do with what art is meant to do today, if one can still ask that kind of normative question. And this comes against the context of a realization, if you will, that what we've long called contemporary art is probably finished. And I think many of us, many colleagues across the world have now come to that conclusion. And it seems more and more the case that the so-called contemporary art was probably the art of the period of globalization in its confident moments. And that now, with what seems like the near collapse of a certain kind of globalization and its structures, its institutions, its reflexes, its vast confidence, as we just saw in Ingrid's presentation, that perhaps all of these institutions and self-understandings that we've built up as people involved in contemporary art, perhaps this is the moment to reevaluate all of that and to see what it is that art really can do, what is its proper business, if you will, how does it engage with urgencies that confront all of us today, and how does it renegotiate its relationship to that other spectral entity, the public, or the public sphere. And in all of this, can art enunciate a notion of citizenship? Is the artist a citizen among other citizens, or is the artist a special kind of citizen? And how does the state of being an artist come into some kind of alignment with the larger citizenry? Now, these are the kinds of questions that I've tried to explore in various things I've done, and I've tried to bring that to bear in this particular discussion. So what I'm going to do is to partly present things that I've presented in the essay, but also further annotate that text with thoughts that have come up since I wrote it and since I've been thinking about these questions. And I have to say that my entry point, if you will, into Marianne's work was actually a work called Pioneer, a video work from 2007, which is at some remove, it would appear, from these otherwise very volatile questions. And many of you will know that work already. But in the way it was presented, in the deep, beautiful chromatics of the video screens, which seem to suggest oceanic depths, linked to a monologue by a diver who was one of the early explorers of what would become the source of Norway's wealth, suddenly there was a vision of the risks, the questions, and the uncertainties that underlay what later became Norway's national mythology, that of what I've called in this essay, petro-prosperity. And for me, that gesture of bringing back a discourse of uncertainty, of anxiety, of hazard, was a very pertinent and important gesture for an artist to make, because it suggests that at least one of the gestures that art needs to make today is that of questioning the grand fetishes that govern our collective being. So, for instance, if there's a certain kind of national mythology, here as elsewhere, perhaps what we see in operation here is the criticality that can be brought into play by a certain way of a form of making art. And to me, it was a great pleasure to be able to trace and follow Marianne's work as it elaborates itself on the cusp between artistic and economic activity, and the way in which it confronts questions of what could properly be called ideology. Also because in these questions you have the constant definition and redefinition of value. At a point when any form of art that any of us might undertake, whether it's in the visual arts, whether it's intellectual activity, whether it's writing, all of that is overdetermined by something that we could still call the culture industry. And how, in that kind of overdetermined context, can one still present projects that are not compromised by the patronal agendas of managerial and bureaucratic elites on the one hand? And how does one elaborate projects that are not inspired by a sort of myth of heroic independence? And it's this intermediate zone that Marianne seems to inhabit and explore to great effect. On the one hand, she is not obsessed with the notion of the artist as heroically independent of all infrastructure. And on the other hand, there is a meticulous negotiation with the infrastructure that makes things possible and yet advances its own agendas. What seems to happen in her work is that she renegotiates, in fact, the implicit contracts of the production systems in which she works and which enable her practice. And it's this criticality, this productive engagement that I respond to very strongly, because in following her work, we also follow the ways in which systems can be made to disclose their own advantages and deficits, their lacunae, if you will, and their nodes of fallibility. And I want to dwell a little on 2 or 3 projects, if I may. This is also an unreal situation to address the artist and tell her about her work. But that's not the spirit in which this is presented. I'm thinking particularly of 3 works, 3 related projects. Investment, which was a social project in photo documentation. Construction Site, which was a social project in architectural intervention. And Landscape, which was an installation with light boxes. In all of these, the artist followed and presented the movements of her income, her own investments, as though they were, as I've said here, as though they were a barium tracer coursing through the circulations of the Norwegian economy, in some sense rendering visible and palpable all kinds of operations that otherwise remain unseen. And in a way, it was an interrogation of a simple term that we all use as cultural practitioners, funding. You know, what does funding really mean? In what sorts of fractions and distributions does funding come to us, and where does it come from? And to me, what was significant is that these projects not only looked back to interrogate how funding operates in an economy, but there was also a conceptual feedback loop where whatever came out as returns of the investment was in fact put out again and brought into play in different social contexts. The artist used her income during this period to make a donation to the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design in Oslo, where she'd been appointed a museum guard, which in itself I find a very interesting shift of location and perspective for an artist. And that donation took the form of a negotiated intervention, the redesign of the staff lunchroom, for which the artist commissioned drawings by the architects Jim Dodson and, unbelievable, this has gone right off my, Mikkel Pedersen. The project grew out of a survey that the artist made, conversing with museum guards and technicians about the kind of lunchroom that they would like. And the formerly pokey lunchroom was then replaced by a more warm, expansive, spatially fluid space, a lounge. And while the artist paid the architects and the construction workers, the museum provided the materials of construction. already you see how the protocols of a given and preordained economic and even political system were tinkered with in some sense. And I respond very strongly to the possibility of these micropolitical tinkerings. Because the work offered an institution, in this case the National Museum, with a social and cultural surplus in the form of a renewed community space, which could not be reduced to mechanisms of price-based compensation. And I'll have more to say about these kinds of surpluses which elude monetization and definition in a capitalist sense. And I want to dwell here a little on the backdrop from which Marianne's practice of the gift emerges, because it has a lot to do with what the sociologist Marcel Mauss pointed out in his work from the 1920s, where he studied the gift exchange economy in Polynesia, Melanesia, and among the First Nations of Northwestern America. And there he pointed out that these acts of donation are charged with the totality of the giver's being, and therefore they function on the principle of implicit reciprocity. It's not just economic, it's also a spiritual action. You give with the totality of yourself, and what the gift carries is also the suggestion that it will be returned with equivalence. So it calls forth a corresponding return, theoretically also summoning forth the recipient's total being. And again, the return is not reducible to a simple economic translation. It's literally not give and take. Something is produced in this exchange which exceeds the definition of the materiality of the gift. And so what you find happening with the mechanism of the gift is that a new form of, if you will, doing economy opens up, and that there is a rearrangement of the relationships of sociality. And what this opens up is the possibility that you could think in terms of an ethic of generosity. And I think what I will try and attend to as I proceed with these remarks is to try and spell out these notions of an ethic of generosity and the possibility of mutuality. So to bring this to bear on Marianne's work, construction site, the museum's reciprocity would imply, among other expressions, taking up the responsibility to safeguard this unexpected space that had opened up in its architecture, and the sense of community that had been opened up on its precincts by the artist. So while allowing the artist to circumvent the embodiment of value exclusively in revenue and its surpluses, this Maussian insistence on the gift also signals her belief in more equitable and even, I would think, utopian relationships of exchange and continuing mutuality among diverse interlocutors. So it's something more than what the system is geared to present. So the principle that many of Marianne's projects hinges on is the reclamation of economic agency for the individual. So on the one hand, you have impersonal, asymmetric systems that monopolize economic circulations, that do not deny participation, but they deny knowledge and access to how the system works. So what Marianne does in these micropolitical situations is to try and reclaim economic agency, but to reclaim it not in the name of the sovereign individual, which is another kind of ideological creature, but to reclaim that economic agency and deposit it in the space of a temporary community, or at least in a space which holds the potential for such a temporary community. And I'm thinking here also of her other work, another of her works, Valgenga, 2008, where once again she worked in an office situation to explore the lacunae or the possibilities of a particular architecture and to relate that to the repressed or hidden desires of the people who use that space and to transform it from an alienating environment to a kind of environment that at least held the possibility of a festive expression of self. So I want to dwell a little on the kinds of spaces that get opened up through the artist's work. And these are spaces of intersubjective encounter. They're where an entanglement takes place between the artist's nominally sovereign individual selfhood and the subjectivities of interlocutors participants, people who get involved in that space and what happens there. And in the process, it seems to me, the new kinds of subjectivity are in fact activated, whether it's in the lunchroom, whether it's in the office where she created this internal facade, so to speak. You find that there is not only a redistribution of capital in how funding is taken from a system and used for almost non-systemic results, but there is also this generation of new spatial and temporal possibilities which did not pre-exist. And importantly, and this is why I think that we see here a complete recalibration of the traditional idea of the role of the artist. The artist here is not an outside consultant, to use the kind of managerial parlance that we should probably apply to many situations where grants are made and funding is offered. Because the technical role that artists play often in such situations is that of an outside consultant. That doesn't happen here. But rather what happens is that the artist becomes a stakeholder in this process of micropolitical transformation, whether it's at the level of a neighborhood, an institution like a museum, or that otherwise unpromising location, an office. And in fact, she becomes, in the way in which she extends herself through the practicality of labor and the capital that she herself brings in, an investor in such a process. And I think that's a radical shift in its own micropolitical, microcosmic way. And it is, in fact, the practical approach of a contributor, not someone who comes in on the wings of a grant proposal, but rather someone who actually goes beyond the stylization of the participatory turn, as we've grown used to calling it, and also someone whose work extends well beyond what I sometimes think of as the aestheticization of much performance art. I mean, there is a certain concern with aestheticization in the realm of performance art, which can actually take away from its original provocative political intention. And so, of course, one might well ask what this has to do with the larger elaborations of society and the political. And I do think that it's possible to see Marianne's works as drafts, or prototypes, if you will, for larger renovations of social structures. They are provocations to the settled spatiality, temporality, architecture, and disposition of institutions. And they are actually all the more effective, I would think, for seeming to act in collaboration with the system. Because I'm not going to say what I miss. In fact, what I found curious and instructive is that there was no confrontational rhetoric. When you entered a situation, and you've said this, you've written this, that you do not intend this to be confrontational in the sense of someone infiltrating. I've used the word infiltrator in my essay, but I know you've written that you don't see this as a hostile act. And I think that is of particular importance, because it suggests the way in which a jiu-jitsu artist would work. And I find this a compelling metaphor, actually, that in jiu-jitsu, you don't apply your energy so much as you use the energy of your opponent to bring about the result you need, which is, of course, that the combat should go your way. And I find that this is an instructive metaphor to use in describing in Marianne's work. And so the outcomes of her work are not consecrated objects, but rather they are unpredictable strategies of renovated sociality, occasions of adjusted perspective, and experiential surpluses that are not containable within market formats, except possibly in the form of documentary residues. And I find that this, again, is a way in which her work eludes the formats that institutions like the market are increasingly eager to bring to the work of art, and that it remains in the realm of work, it remains elusive, it remains a strategy, and is not sort of commodified. And I want to expand the context of this work in a certain way by dwelling on what I've called here, following others, the fate of the work of art in the era of vampire capitalism. We've already seen to great effect what vampire capitalism means in the financial sector. And I think that it is not inopportune to designate this form of this phase of capitalism as vampire capitalism today, because it's in one sense undone all the Cold War cartographies. Today, the former first, second, and third worlds are all inextricably knotted together under an insatiable system, a system whose appetites for consumption are insatiable. So the system preys on entire population, it poaches on continents, it depletes the environment, and it accelerates the highly networked flow of ever-increasing volumes of goods, services, people, and information across the planet. And if you step back and look at it, it's a truly not awe-inspiring, but probably grief-inspiring vista. Because on the one hand, you see the flows of cheap labor from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America moving towards North America, Europe, and the Gulf states. You also see body piracy on a grand scale, where illegal migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and from South Asia cross over into Europe. You also find East European workers shifting to North Europe and West Europe. And I knew this was going to happen. I have shifted too abruptly. Jobs that are snatched from Britain and the US are outsourced to India, China, and the Philippines. India and China lease vast tracts of agricultural land in Western and Central Africa. So African farmers work at subsistence wages to produce food for Asia's expanding population-heavy giants, whose agriculture, meanwhile, is dominated by cash crops. So you have, if you will, exploitations within exploitations. So we have this vampire capitalism, which is dominated by exponents of hyper-consumerism on the one hand, and by exponents of this kind of spectral, speculative financial operation that we've just seen explained in great detail. So that's how it works top-down. But what vampire capitalism does is to conscript into its global ranks an ever-growing army of atomized subjectivities, people who bear what, following Zygmunt Bauman, I call a zombie modernity. Because these are people who are conflicted between pasts that are imagined and futures that are desired, but that are predicated entirely on the pursuit of aspiration. So what you have in the zombie modernity is not the critical, progressive, affirmative articulation of modernity, but rather its mirage-like, spectacular, narcotic aspects. So the basic ritual of vampire capitalism is the worship of the commodity. And I want to dwell here a little on one of the most celebrated accounts of commodity fetishism, which of course came from Marx, where he talks of how the mechanism of commodity fetishism works when you ascribe fictive and even mythic value to a commodity, rendering the labor that went into it invisible. So commodity fetishism, on the one hand, eclipses productive labor. It conceals the alienating distance between ourselves and the products that we desire and consume. It also exaggerates the commodity into a mythic talisman. And above all, it incessantly reproduces the consumer as desiring subject. And of course, it's Adam Smith had the classical example of diamond to explain this, why carbon compacted through the centuries should have this exaggerated aura. And in a sense, that loop was closed by your own reflections on the diamond and what this stands for. But fetish thinking is not confined, of course, to commodities. Fetishization pervades many aspects of our collective life. It, for instance, accounts for national mythology, where certain kinds of narratives are drawn out of the entanglements and the fabric of history and reified in a certain way. The unquestioning belief in a state, again, is a form of fetish thinking. The adoration of the art object in the art market, devoid of the contexts that make it possible, that again is a form of fetishizing. And what Marianne's work does is to subject all these articulations of the fetish to critique. And while I was thinking about this, I found myself returning to a beautiful passage in Agamben, where he talks of profanation. And he says that what was once profaned, that which was unavailable and separate, once profaned, that which was unavailable and separate loses its aura and is returned to use. And I find this a compelling tool for us to be able to think about what is possible through the form of critique. And I'm also dwelling a little on the etymology here, because to profane, the act of profanation comes from the Latin profanum, which is before or outside the temple. And I found myself thinking that when you showed the image of Vima outside the Kunsthall, in a sense. I don't want to offend the Kunsthall by suggesting it's a temple, but certainly to a certain kind of, I'm using the word as shorthand here, popular consciousness with certain notions of art and where art belongs. The institutions of art are temple-like, and to place something outside them is probably an act of profanation. So I want to tease out a little bit this process of profanation. By dismantling the fetish and releasing the psychic surplus from mystique into practical use, Marianne releases the particularities of labor, time, affect, and reason that are compressed within it. I'm thinking way back now to an early project, the poster project, which unfolded in the blood bank of the University Hospital of Oslo, and literally brought about a transfusion of culture, if you will, where through acts of dialogue and negotiation and working together, the artist relayed the nursing staff of the blood bank into an appreciation of culture at large through reproductions of artworks, to visits to museums and galleries. And not only was this an act of working in a social context where culture seemed to be at a remove, but it also brought into play questions about who owns the work of art. Does art belong to collectors and to those who know about art? Or does art belong as an experience to those who, in fact, experience it? And I think philosophically that continues to be an important question, that the ownership of the object cannot contain the experience of the object, which of course belongs to potentially an infinite number of people. The poster project also brought into question notions of patronage, connoisseurship, taste, and again the question of what kind of public can be developed for art. Does the public even want art? And by what forms of dialogue can you bridge this gulf? And I'll return to that a little later, because I want us to maybe explore together this notion of the democratization of art. So not only does Marianne's art attend to the economic surplus contained within the commodity fetish, but it also addresses other conceptions of surplus. It looks at surplus as excluded material, as the intransigent remainder, as repressed contents, as the repressed contents of a way in which a society imagines itself. And I'm thinking here of the haunting voices of Roma women in her work Underground from 2007. And I'm thinking also of Vima, which I've seen images of and you have all experienced in actual life, where again it seems to me that what is being brought to view is objects, traces, elements, symptoms that have otherwise been repressed within the narrative of a society in the ascendant. What is marginalized, what is no longer visible and audible, all this emerges equally as a surplus that deserves attention. And in the context of Vima, again, I want to think a little bit about the ways in which it's been responded to. And I'm grateful for the account you opened with of the different kinds of responses that it merited, because there is a certain sort of art historical reflex, if you will, that would prompt some of us to read Vima as something that might stand in the lineage of, say, Richard Serra. I mean, it's these great, gigantic, rust-raddled, archetypal sculptural forms which suggest, in fact, derelict ships. But to my mind, that is actually a way of trapping this provocative object in a history that seems a little too ready-made for us to be able to take it seriously. And maybe with the artist, we need to now venture into that intermediate space, that cusp between art, economic activity, and ideology, where we are no longer really certain of the criteria that we can bring to bear on what we are looking at. And I think that is probably as much of a crisis as anything else. Out of what lineages and out of what training are we actually looking at art? And in what conversation are we constructing the art that we see? And I will close now with 3 or 4 annotations, as I call them, to what has gone before. It's important to keep in mind that Marianne produces imaginative and experiential surpluses whose value cannot be monetized, or that cannot be integrated seamlessly into dominant narratives about the age, society, a particular society. And that these acts of excess, these activated latencies, what I've called the uncontainable, all of these have a certain revelatory value for us. But how do we regard such acts of revelatory value at a time and in a social media context, for instance, where many economic activities now generate social, pedagogic, organizational, communicative value that also cannot be monetized? I have to say that these are preliminary thoughts, but I'm thinking particularly of a number of contexts on the net, for instance, the formation of communities, the dissemination of services that are not and probably cannot immediately be monetized. So how does one, these are activities that are ambiguously placed within the realm of capital, but point outside it. I think that some of these activities are systematic without being systemic, if you will. So how does one align the work of an artist like Marianne in the context of such otherwise orthodox capitalist maneuvers that seem to throw out non-monetizable value? I think there are actually, of course, very precise differences that we can delineate. In the first place, we are returned here to the fact that this is the solitary activity of an artist who is negotiating with conceptions of citizenship. Her interventions and her contributions are unpredictable. They do not arise from systematic, programmed economic activity at all. If anything, it's the other way around. They are disruptions of such activity. There's also the question of scale. And I find it important that all of these initiatives are and seem to remain micropolitical. And they do not expand to a scale where they lose the precision and the power of their meaning. They also are, there is a certain tacticality about these contributions. They do not linger long enough anywhere to become a mannerism, a style, or a template. And of course, they definitely do not produce user experiences. I think in a mental world of proliferating user experiences, we need to remember that there is still a sharp distinction between that and what we experience as people experiencing art. Is therefore Marianne's work readable as an articulation of what I've elsewhere called insurgent citizenship? Is a question I'd close with. And I'm thinking here of insurgency as a claim on citizenship, not something that defies the state necessarily, but also as something that actually works with and overturns popular conceptions that inhabit society at large. And if art is, as we see, a process of communicative engagement and not just a production line of objects, what does it mean, as I said earlier, to be an artist among citizens? The challenges are and have always been and continue to be extremely real. There are accreted understandings or misunderstandings of art, expectations of what art does and what artists are like. So when an artist wishes to relocate or to shift the location of art, On the one hand, from within, we see this as a democratization of art, but the question is, do the demos want it? Or do they want it in precisely that way? And therefore, is there another kind of afterlife? Is there another phase that this kind of artistic activity seems to call for? Because it is a courageous wager on amplifying the public, to whom art can not merely have a meaning, but to whom it can be a domain in which to have a stake. And it's in the accepting of the paradoxes and difficulties of this situation that this art really takes its stand. So I'll finish really by suggesting that this is an art that keeps several conceptions of the artist, classical as well as more near in time, in play simultaneously. There is, on the one hand, the model of the classical avant-garde artist as adversarial, disruptive, transgressive. And there is also, contending with that in the same practice, a more near-in-time model of the artist as researcher, interlocutor, someone who forms relationships that are communicative and is concerned with intersubjective and collaborative action. So we return to where this set of remarks began, which is by noting that Marianne invites us to reconsider the vexed nature of contemporary artistic labor and the institutions, the contexts, the relays of meaning in which this takes place. If her studio has expanded across a field of relationships, strategies, situations, and outcomes, it also tests the notions of what alienated labor can mean. I think this work extends across a scale from deeply interior, deeply solitary conceptions through to intersubjective and collaborative engagements to a point where the labor seems almost alienated from the person who made it because the object has gone away and taken new life in the minds of others. And that also is a form of alienation, not classical alienated labor, but possibly another kind of alienation that is probably implicit in the kind of artwork that this is. And I'll close with one final thought, which is that in seeking out mutualities and solidarities and forms of dissidence as an outcome of art, and I'm going out a little on a limb when I say this, but it led me to think, when we were speaking a little earlier, that we're also being asked to reflect on precisely how an artist makes a way in the world today. Professionally, there is, of course, always the model of following a career, which is calibrated through periodic gallery exhibitions, auction sales, and all of the paraphernalia of that kind of choice. Over against that, what we see in Marianne's work is the possibility of another mode that is parallel to, perhaps sometimes convergent with that, but which seems to retain its own ground and mark off its own premises. And is that a way forward? Is that far too utopian? Or is it utopian with a strong element of practical application? Whatever the particular definition we might wish to accord Marianne's kind of practice, I think it reminds us of something that I think we all forget in a certain mad onrush in all of our lives, which is the need to calibrate precisely how that journey is to be conducted. And that thought, simple as it sounds and even banal, resonates for me because it seemed to form one of the important subtexts, Ingrid, in your presentation, because, there is a very old-fashioned word for what we saw with that kind of runaway inflation of spectral desires. It is greed. So in the end, how you calibrate your artistic career is also about a sense of achieving measure. And maybe that is one of the subtexts in Marianne Heier's practice as well. How to achieve a shifting, fluctuating, elusive, but nonetheless real measure. And I will leave you with those thoughts. Thank you for your patience.